Good evening and thanks for joining us. I'm Jim Ninsel, host of AZ Illustrated Politics, our weekly analysis and commentary on local, state, and national affairs. Tonight, we'll talk about the latest efforts by Gabby Giffords and Mark Kelly to urge lawmakers to expand background checks on gun sales. We'll also check in on Governor Brewer's push to expand Medicaid in Arizona and catch up on the debate over comprehensive immigration reform. But first, a look at today's top stories.
Drivers traveling east on I-10 tonight can expect some major delays due to construction. I-10 east of Tucson between State Roads 83 and 90 will be closed tonight beginning at 9 p.m. so crews can remove an old train bridge that crosses the road. Drivers will have to take a major detour around the construction. That detour is expected to add 2 hours to most drivers' trips. ADOT is hoping the work will wrap up overnight and I-10 can reopen by 6 a.m. However, the expected rain and cold weather overnight could slow work down. In southern Arizona, we've seen snow a few times this winter, and flakes have certainly fallen in the northern part of the state, but water conservation experts say the snowpack is still below normal.
Our predictions at this point is that the runoff into the major rivers and streams will definitely be below normal conditions.
Arizona has been in the grips of a decade-long drought. Farmers in every Arizona county are now eligible for low-interest emergency drought relief loans from the federal government. The JFK Museum announced today that former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords is the recipient of this year's Profile and Courage Award. In its announcement, the museum said Giffords, who now leads the gun control super PAC Americans for Responsible Solutions, is being honored for the courage she has demonstrated in her, quote, fearless public advocacy for policy reforms aimed at reducing gun violence. The award will be presented by Caroline Kennedy on May 5th. And that's a look at tonight's headlines.
A surge in hiring produced the best jobs report in 4 years, with unemployment dropping to 7.7%.
We look behind the job gains to see which sectors of the economy are on the mend and how the American workplace is changing.
Then Margaret Warner examines the charges against Suleiman Abu Ghaith, an al-Qaeda spokesman and son-in-law to Osama bin Laden, who appeared in a New York court today.
From Caracas, Matt Fry of Independent Television News reports on the state funeral for Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, attended by dignitaries from more than 50 nations.
This feels less like a funeral and more like a celebration of immortality. The government has taken the decision not to bury him, but to embalm Chavez and keep him lying in state forever.
David Brooks and Ruth Marcus analyze the week's news.
And we close with a writer's reflection on the earthquake and tsunami that hit Japan 2 years ago.
That's all ahead on tonight's NewsHour.
Tonight on Arizona Week, Michael Chihak talks with experts on water security. Is the Southwest ready for growing demand?
We, in central Arizona in particular, are quite, let's say, vulnerable to very long-term shortages or droughts on the Colorado River.
You're looking at about a long-term imbalance of about 3.2 million acre feet.
That's tonight at 8:30 on PBS 6.
Gabby Giffords and her husband, former astronaut Mark Kelly, made a dramatic return to the Safeway shopping center where just over 2 years ago, Gabby survived being shot through the head. They were joined by other survivors of the mass shooting to call on Senators Jeff Flake and John McCain to support an expansion of background checks on gun sales. Joining me to talk about the politics of gun violence, former state lawmaker Paula Abad, former Tucson City Councilwoman Carol West, former state lawmaker Jonathan Payton, and Hispanic Chamber of Commerce President Leah Marquez Peterson. Thanks for all of you for being here. Carol, it was a very emotional scene this week when Gabby and Mark and the other survivors of the shooting went to the shopping center to call on the senators to support this legislation on background checks. But even as they were speaking in Washington, that legislation was really starting to fall apart, or the bipartisan agreement on it was starting to fall apart. Why do you think it's so difficult for folks to come to agreement? Mark Kelly was saying at the conference 90% of Americans support this.
Well, it is perplexing. Some of the news releases that I've seen show that there are about 3 different bills in the Senate that the Judiciary Committee has been looking at, and maybe they ought to get in a huddle and decide on one bill. But having background checks on internet sales, gun shows, all of that, I think is something that they should focus on perhaps first, and then go from there to some of the other items like curtailing the sale of semi-automatics and things like that. So, I think Gabby and Mark are doing a wonderful job in getting the public informed on this subject, and so Godspeed to them and Godspeed to the Judiciary Committee to get something put together.
Jonathan, what do you think is the reason that there can't seem to be a political agreement in Washington on this?
Well, the interesting thing is whether this will ever come to a vote, and that's not really due to a Jeff Flake or a John McCain. It's really due to guys like Mark Pryor or Senator Begich out of Alaska or Mary Landrieu in Louisiana. There's a lot of Democratic U.S. senators that don't want this to come up to a vote because they're in basically red states and they feel like it ultimately would be very unpopular. And probably the one that would be the one who really doesn't want this to go anywhere would be Senator Majority Leader Harry Reid. He was endorsed by the NRA in his election, likely helped save him in that race. And I think the second issue really has to be that if you say the term background checks, I think most Americans feel that sounds like a great thing. But the reality is you basically are going to be abandoning or prohibiting private sales of guns, whether that's on Craigslist, whether it's to your neighbor, whether it's a widow who is selling her husband's collection, that sort of thing. Those would be essentially banned or very prohibitively difficult to do.
And Leah, do you think that's a problem to have these sorts of hurdles on private sales?
I think it's challenging, and I think it's certainly complex, but I was with the community, as we all were in the nation, watching after the tragedy here in Tucson, and I think a lot of the business community in Tucson thinks that background checks are reasonable. I think that certainly even when we purchase auto insurance, there are credit checks that are done, they look at your driving record. I mean, there's some kind of system in place. I don't know exactly what they could put in place with the politics that's going on in the nation and certainly in the state, but I think background checks make sense.
And Paula, if they can't find agreement on the background checks, which as polling shows are popular, do you think that there's any chance that you're going to go further, as Carol was saying, on high-capacity magazines or automatic weapons, AR-15s, that sort of thing, that other people are looking to ban that is more controversial?
You know, the issue that has the most broad-based support is the background checks, expanding the background checks. If we can't get agreement on the background checks, it's not likely we're going to get increase or decrease the size of the magazines or the assault weapons. I just don't think so. I think what we're going to deal with, and we're going to talk about it more today on various issues, is that issue of whether the Congress people are willing to do what's good for the public versus what the lobbyists and the NRA are pushing them to do. And all of these Congress people have issues with election and re-election, and that struggle between standing up for what's good for the country and good for the people versus what's good for them in getting reelected.
The only thing I want to say about that, though, is that there are principled people who don't believe that giving the government the power to look into your private life is necessarily a good thing. I think we saw an example of principled leadership the other day with the filibuster, and I think that if you look at, there's some people who are very concerned that this would be a slippery slope. We would start out with this law, and then we would start going into other laws, which we just discussed. I think that a lot of people feel that the proponents of these bills really would love to see a complete ban on firearms across the country, and they have said that. Dianne Feinstein, who is a sponsor of some of this legislation, has stated that she wants to basically ban guns in the United States. Chuck Schumer has said repeatedly he does not believe the Second Amendment applies to self-defense and applies to right to bear arms. So those are very central, fundamental principles that a lot of Americans hold, and that's what this debate is about. It is definitely about what's right for the country. There's politics that enters into it, but it's also about a difference of opinion on principles.
And principles aren't necessarily just these people on the far left that say they have opinions, or the people on the far right. What we have to look at is the majority of the people in this country land somewhere in the middle, and their voices are being ignored because the voices on the extreme are controlling this dialogue. Rand Paul can do his filibuster and make his point, and that's fine. But to say that that's a principled stand, that's an extreme principled stand. But we need people speaking up for the middle of America.
What did you think of McCain's criticism of Rand Paul in that filibuster?
I actually, I feel like, I've certainly been a hawk on a lot of defense issues over the years, but I do think that as I've gotten older, I'm more and more concerned about civil liberties. I'm certainly concerned about the Second Amendment. I'm also concerned about any president, any chief executive having the power to kill American citizens without due process of the law. And I think that, a long time ago when it was a different president, I might have felt differently, and now I look at it much differently. And I think that we have to be having this debate. I think it was a very healthy thing for this country. And you saw the supporters in this filibuster were not just Republicans. There was a cross-section. There was Wyden from, it was a Democratic senator supported that, had some of the same questions. And I think that since the war, I think a lot of us, and I'm an intelligence officer with the United States Army, so I definitely have maybe a different perspective of this, but I think a lot of us are concerned about the increasing power of the executive branch, regardless who our commander-in-chief is.
But the Attorney General basically stopped the filibuster when he said that this could not be used against American citizens on American soil.
And I think the concern is he refused to answer that in a forthright manner on repeated questioning. He was asked again and again, can this happen? He said that use of that would not be appropriate, but he didn't say it wouldn't be constitutional. And finally, through a letter, he finally admitted that it wouldn't be unconstitutional. I think that raises serious concerns with people when you can't answer a very simple question. When the chief law enforcement officer of this country cannot answer, can you kill an American citizen without due process from one of these drones flying above?
All right, I want to shift gears here to another contentious issue that's on the agenda in Washington, which is immigration reform. Last week, as the sequester loomed, the Homeland Security released about 2,000 undocumented immigrants from detention centers around the country. You had Governor Brewer coming out and saying that she thought this was payback to Arizona to punish Arizonans by releasing these detainees. I spoke with Congressman Raul Grijalva. He was unhappy about it as well because he felt as if this was going to throw something in the road of immigration reform. Leo, your thoughts on how this process unfolded last week?
In reading about it and hearing about it in the media, it just seemed like it was handled in a very sloppy manner. The fact that Arizona was not notified that people were going to be let out of these various detention centers, I think was a little surprising. And I'd also be concerned, like Congressman Grijalva, about the impact this might have on the bigger conversation we're having about federal immigration reform.
Paul, you think it was a blunder by the Homeland Security folks?
Well, I think what we are hearing, maybe behind the scenes, is that it was a rogue move by somebody in Homeland Security and people that don't believe that Napolitano actually knew that this was going to happen. So who knows the story? Whatever the case, it was a blunder. And I think the conversation between government, federal government, and state government needs to be improved. I think our governor needs to not be reactionary and assume that everything is against her. And I think also Homeland Security needs to do a better job. I think they need to have communication with the governors in those states. They shouldn't just be doing this without contacting them.
And Jonathan, let's shift over to the whole question of comprehensive immigration reform. And you voted, when you were in the legislature, you voted for SB 1070. You've said you did not want to see amnesty when you were on the campaign trail running for Congress. The Republican Party seems to be shifting a little bit, considering a path to citizenship. Your thoughts on what the policy should be here as a comprehensive immigration reform comes together?
Well, the first thing I want to say is Department of Homeland Security is the last place you want to have a rogue move. I mean, that's probably not the place that you want to see independent action from the Secretary of Homeland Security. I think that the big issue
it wasn't the secretary.
Well,
talking about the individual that implemented.
That's what I'm saying. That you want to make sure that she's the one that's running the show and the commander in chief, and not some rogue element within that organization, within that department. I think that the concern that I have is about this whole issue about what happened is really, I don't think it was a slight against Arizona. I think it was a part of the traveling roadshow that this is going to be affected by the sequester, that's going to be affected by the sequester, et cetera. And I think they made a terrible mistake by using this as an example. I think that certainly there's a shifting opinion within the Republican Party right now. I do think, though, that the central issue will be about path to citizenship. I think that's really where this boils down to. Jeb Bush came out with a book this last week. He was criticized from some quarters because he said we should not have a path to citizenship. I think that if there is going to be a compromise that is in the offing, it's going to be on a temporary status of workers and not necessarily on a path to citizenship. I think that's where you reach the irresistible force meets the immovable object on that very topic. I think people are afraid that if you reward someone with citizenship, if they've entered in illegally, I think there's concern about that. I do think that maybe there's a way to work things out with temporary work status, that kind of thing. And I think that's where the debate's going to be.
Leah, your thoughts on that?
You know, it's interesting. Our chamber and many other organizations have partnered in something called the Real Arizona Coalition. And I wanted to bring it up because it's a group of very diverse organizations, from Latino groups to business organizations, faith-based groups, who've come together on kind of a federal immigration platform for Arizona and have been out there really advocating on behalf of it. What we hear overwhelmingly is a lot of the immigrants interested in legal status. That's primarily their focus, but I think we also need a pathway to citizenship. Guest worker programs, so vital, so important. I hope this doesn't get hung up in the politics, which I'm sure it may certainly occur, and we're seeing that play out in the national press. But I think you see a lot of varying groups coming together in Arizona to talk about the importance of passing some kind of federal immigration reform this go round.
Carol, your thoughts on where this should go from here?
Well, I really believe in a path to citizenship, but I think they'd have to go to the end of the line. And you know, one of the things that Jeb Bush was pointing out is that immigrants are what is causing our population to grow in this country right now. And we should be thinking ahead to how these people can be educated so that they provide us with additional jobs and employment. And it just makes sense to, they're here, a lot of them, and they're going to continue to be here through no fault of their own. So we really need to put some of these rules aside. And he says we need to start over. Our immigration system is broken. And that's the federal system, which is, after all, where immigration should be looked at. I think 1070 was a big mistake, but it was born out of frustration because the feds weren't doing anything. So I can understand why the legislature took a stand that I consider not to be a good thing. So in the meantime, though, Jeb said that he would allow these people to be here legally, but he wouldn't give them a path to citizenship, and yet he's backpedaling now on some of the talk shows and saying a path to citizenship is the way to go.
Which I think is also going on within the Republican Party, and that shows some of the tensions that are happening there. But Paula, there was another situation in court this week with the governor's attorneys and attorneys for opposing this, saying that the kids who are here through the DREAM Act and under the Deferred Action Program that the Obama administration has put forward should be able to receive driver's licenses in Arizona, and the governor's fighting that. Should these kids be able to get driver's licenses?
Well, you know, they're allowed to work here, but now they're not going to be allowed to drive. So how are we going to resolve that? It's a real tricky position for the governor to be in. She's trying to get her Medicaid expansion passed. She's got her far right wing that doesn't want driver's license for these kids. So she's in a difficult position. Should they? You know, I think it's probably the right thing to do. The community and maybe the Hispanic community believes it's the right thing to do. I don't think this governor has enough power behind her right now to make that happen. I think she's going to go with the right wing on this one and oppose it.
Jonathan, your thoughts on whether these young people should be able to get driver's licenses?
Well, You know, my biggest issue is we've been talking about really congressional action about what's going to happen if there's going to be some kind of legislation or something like that coming through. That's the way our process works. We have the legislative branch working with the executive branch to come up with a solution. They haven't done a very good job of it, but that's the way the process works. We have divided government in this country. The president took, in my opinion, an extra legal step of basically using the executive branch to issue a fiat and say, okay, you're going to be in this country legally because of a stroke of a pen without that debate in Congress. Now he's saying, well, I don't like the state's reaction to that in the individual states. Well, why not just have a federal driver's license at that point? Because he's the one that's essentially dictating to our own state what's legal and what's not.
Well, it's not the Obama administration fighting this battle, though. It's advocates on behalf of the immigrants themselves.
I think that there's certainly those same groups are very close to the administration, and this was created because the administration took a stance without working with Congress to come up with a solution where we actually go through this process, get it voted. That's the way our representative republic works. This is not a government by fiat, and I think that's what the concern is about the expanded power of the presidency. And I think that comes down to what is right for the American people. You may not agree with where we're at politically right now on immigration, but is the solution that one branch of government is going to dictate to the rest of the country what the policy is going to be?
But Jonathan, if we felt like this government could work and resolve those issues, then we'd come to some consensus. But
we do that every election.
There's very little consensus. And what the Republican Party has seen is that this public is tired of the blockade, the party of no. And that's why we're seeing John Boehner, who is being more conciliatory and trying to get legislation through. Violence against women was passed.
And that process...
And that was because... I think our chamber also had the same concerns around the executive order and the way that it was passed. But now that it's here, and these young people have legal status, they should have driver's licenses. Representing employers, we need them in the workforce. So I think driver's license are key. I also think Pima Community College made a very bold step this past week in allowing these dreamers to come through an in-state tuition. And I hope that follows at the U of A and ASU and our other universities.
And there are a lot of jobs that require a driver's license and the use of a car. And so what we're really doing is preventing these people from getting jobs. In rural areas, there isn't a bus that they can take to work. And even in Tucson, the service is minimal. So if these people have the right to employment, then we've got to iron out some of the kinks so that they can be employed and be useful citizens paying taxes in our society.
All right, and we're running out of time on the program, and there's one more topic I want to get to, which is the Medicaid expansion here in Arizona. The governor has been pushing for this Medicaid expansion. There are Republicans in the legislature who do not like the idea of expanding the Medicaid. It basically would take it up to 133% the federal poverty level. Jonathan, last night I was talking with someone from the Southern Arizona Leadership Council who, in the business community, who just feels like this is something that ought to happen, but he's concerned about what's happening at the legislature. Is this thing going to be able to get passed up at the legislature?
You know, I would normally say that it wasn't going to pass, but the governor was able to get Prop 100 through the legislature. Never believed that would happen either. So I never say never in politics. I do think that it faces some significant hurdles. The biggest one is Proposition 108, the prohibition on raising taxes without a 2/3 majority in the Senate or the House. And they're trying to get around that. I don't know that they can legally do that. I think that this is lawsuit bait essentially for a group like the Goldwater Institute. They've been extremely successful on clean elections, on a lot of other issues that they've fought over the Constitution. And the real central debate is if the legislature defines a specific amount of what this tax or fee or whatever you want to call it is going to be, that would fall within the penumbra of uncertainty about whether that would be a Prop 108 violation. If it doesn't, and if they basically give the executive branch a blank check, that raises concerns, and I don't think you could get a 51% majority in House or Senate to do that.
Carol, your thoughts on the policy issue of increasing the Medicaid to 133% of the federal poverty level?
I think the proposed assessment that the hospitals would pay would help to relieve the general fund of some of the obligations that they have. And if the hospitals are behind this, they are willing to assess themselves this fee And apparently there is a precedent from some other agencies in the state government that have been allowed to do this. And the governor thinks that if this is called an assessment rather than a tax, that she might be able to get this through. But more importantly, insurance costs for businesses in this state are going up astronomically. And one of the reasons is that people who are really sick go to the emergency room when they don't have health insurance. And those who have private insurance are paying an average of $1,700 more per insurance policy. That's money that could be used for other things if this were put in place. And it just seems to me that we ought to help Arizona families with these costs, and we also ought to be thinking about businesses that are shouldering a big burden with insurance costs.
And Leah, the Hispanic Chamber is behind the expansion?
Yeah, this is an issue that I think the business community has stepped up and said this makes sense. There are 30-some chambers of commerce who've written a letter to the governor and her staff in support of her decision for Medicaid expansion. So regardless of the politics, which I know is always something very complex to study up in the Phoenix area, I think that this is something that makes sense for all of us.
And it makes sense, the business community feels it's important because?
Because, I mean, it's a cost savings for the state. It's the right thing to do for, I think, Arizona's families.
And Paula, is this something that can actually get through the legislature? Democrats are going to be behind it, but how many Republicans can you bring over?
That's the question. And there's so much pressure from the far right and from the party, the Republican Party. A lot of the districts are voting to oppose the Medicaid expansion, so there's a lot of pressure on the Republican legislators. It's unlikely that this is going to come forward as a bill. It's probably going to be resolved in the budget. It's going to make it more difficult for Democrats because there'll be poison pills put into the budget. That'll make it harder for us to support the expansion because there'll be other things in there that we won't like. But the key thing here, I really believe, is that if we do not pass this Medicaid expansion, the state will have to come up with $1.5 billion to cover that population, as opposed to bringing in $2 billion of our tax dollars at the federal level and just bringing it in. All we're doing is asking for an assessment on the hospitals to cover this, and it's going to make a tremendous. It's a $4 billion difference, really.
Well, Jonathan, we've got less than a minute left, but there is concern from folks on the right that even if you're talking about federal dollars, it's still adding to the deficit.
It's still adding to the deficit, and also it's not like this is free money. Somebody had to pay for it somewhere in the United States. Our tax dollars did go in to pay for this, and I think that there's concern about, once again, the expansion. The Senate president was on here a few weeks ago with Paul and I, and at that time he sounded like it could happen. Most recently he said that he thinks that those chances are much less than when he was on the show. So I don't know what's going to happen. I do think it's going to be a very knockdown, drag-out fight in the Arizona legislature.
Very much.
All right, and we're going to talk a lot more in depth, a whole half-hour show on the Medicaid expansion next week on AZ Illustrated Politics. And unfortunately, we are out of time this evening. We will leave the conversation there for this week. I would like to thank my guests, and we'll be right back with some closing thoughts. You can learn more about politics by visiting azpm.org or by following us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Jim Nitzel. Thank you for watching.